Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. 73 years ago, a 2,000-year-old dream became reality as a Jewish state was born anew in its ancient homeland. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, adopting a plan to partition the British Mandate into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. We are honored to be joined today by Ambassador Ron Prosor, Israel's legendary permanent representative to the United Nations from 2011 to 2015, and a very dear friend of AJC, to discuss how the Partition Plan set into motion the birth of the State of Israel and what followed at the UN and beyond. Moderating today's conversation is AJC CEO David Harris. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. After we hear from David and our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. And with that, David, the floor is yours.
Daniel, thank you, and hello to our worldwide audience on this historic day. And Daniel, I'm very glad you used the word legendary to describe our featured guest, my dear friend, Ron Prosor. He is indeed a model of Israeli diplomacy and what it should be. He's wise, he's analytical, he's strategic, and at times, and if we're lucky today, he's witty as well. We very much wanted to have this conversation today, even though it's a Sunday. I hope it's not an inconvenience for some in our audience, because we felt it was important to time the conversation with his 73rd anniversary. So Ron, first of all, welcome. And let me begin by asking you, from the perspective of Zionism and the construction of a Jewish state, the rebirth of a Jewish state, just how important was November 29th, 1947?
David, first of all, allow me to say that it's a privilege and an honor to share the stage with you. You're doing amazing things for the Jewish people, the state of Israel, as a direct correlation. And yes, this was an important day, but I think it's important before we jump into the partition plan that we should clearly use this opportunity today to say that although it's incredibly important for Israel's history, we cannot forget that this was really a result of over 60 years of Zionist activities that preceded 181. Therefore, the myth, that has been strengthened that Israel was established only because of UNGA 181 is not exactly true. Take for example, the San Remo conference in 1920, where we missed the 100th anniversary because of the COVID-19. That was the first time ever that the international community really formally recognized the need for a national home for the Jewish people, adopting the Balfour Declaration. And as you know, our mutual friend, Professor Ken Stein, really made the point, and I think it's important before we jump in that we give our audience really the notion that this was result, of a lot of work by Ben Gurion, by Golda, by Abba Evan, by Chaim Weizmann, Theodor Herzl. So in the sense, okay, so let's jump into the partition plan. And I don't know how many people know that behind the scenes was really a first UN filibuster, because on the day of the original vote on November 26th, the World Zionist Organization looked and found out there were only 15 votes for Israel. And in essence, you needed more than 60% of the vote. And only 4 votes and against votes count. So absentee votes are good because they don't count against. So what could they do? They basically created the UN filibuster at the General Assembly and ran the clock until, you know, not all UN personnel are really insisting on working overtime all the time. So they managed to delay the vote by 48 hours because of Thanksgiving. I won't make a pun on Thanksgiving on a certain day like this, but you know, God works in mysterious ways. So it worked, and the vote was postponed until Friday the 28th, which of course in Israel is the 29th. This gave them some time to work, and in 48 hours, and this is what I want our, the audience to really understand what it means, working around the clock to make something happen. It happened then, it happened before me and after me and during our time, to really make things, publicly behind the scenes, make it happen. And the stories, Dave, the stories that made this happen are absolutely amazing, and we can spend the whole evening, but I picked up a couple of stories for you. One, they began doing some phone calls, and they, for example, had to get China to not vote against us. So they found this guy called Two Gun Cohen. The guy was you remember him, David? Yeah, the guy was basically a British and a Canadian adventurer, saved, I won't get into the whole story, saved the Chinese in Canada, became one of the only, I think the only non-Chinese general in the Chinese army, lost his hand. That's why he was called Two-Gun Cohen, because with one hand, he can operate the shotgun in an amazing way. And bottom line, Two-Gun Cohen flew over to San Francisco and convinced the Chinese delegation to abstain from voting. And of course, he succeeded. Then you had the Thai prince. The Thai prince is an interesting, there was the Thai government wanted to vote against, and the Thai prince that served as the representative to the UN was put on the Queen Mary. He was asked to go on the Queen Mary. I mean, today I would also like to do a cruise. I'm not sure, but the Queen Mary is quite an incentive. So by coincidence, he was absent in the vote. And the last story is Liberia. Liberia, I would even brand it as a flat tire issue, because in Liberia, there was a very interesting person called Harvey Firestone, who had direct contact with the president of Liberia. Why? Because all the rubber that we know was basically produced in Liberia. He phoned the president, told him, you have to vote for Israel. And this is how the phrase came, when the rubber hits the road, David. So Liberia was on board. Bottom line, you have many stories, and I cannot be remiss by reminding everyone of Eleanor Roosevelt, who also, during Thanksgiving, took the time, phoned different heads of delegation, and in essence, created a situation where we, had the vote and basically made it happen.
Great stories, Ron. Thank you. Let me add, there were some other heroes of the story, particularly from Latin America. The president of the UN General Assembly, who went along with your filibuster, who went along with the delay, was from Brazil.
Absolutely.
And one of the driving forces, who had also served on the UN Special Committee on Palestine, which recommended to the General Assembly, was from Guatemala. So I also want to give a shout out, as you may wish, to a number of Latin American countries that really made a difference here.
Absolutely. And by the way, the son of the Brazilian ambassador phoned me to the UN. I invited him to the office and gave, really huge respect for I think it's his grandfather.
It was his grandfather.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
So
lots of stories. So let me ask you one of those historically hypothetical questions, Ron, just for fun. Had this vote not taken place, in your estimation, would the state of Israel have been created along the same timeline? Would circumstances have been different? What are your thoughts?
So I believe the answer is yes, because of what I said in the past. But don't forget that gave, I think, the push. You remember that after the Partition Plan, the declaration to basically establish the state of Israel was really a huge debate. Would Israel do that? What's going to happen? And in the sense, I think that it would have happened in any case. But of course, at that time, you had, I think, for the first time, the support of both the Soviet Union and the United States for obvious political reason at that time. And yes, so it was something that the state of Israel, we cannot forget. This is one of the few good things that the UN ever did for the state of Israel.
We'll get to the bad things in just a moment. But I wanted to ask you, the Arab world.
David, can I just say,
of course,
that after Israel tried, I think 3 times before that, 2 times before that, the third time, to basically there was an attempt to join the UN on the 15th of May, a day after that establishment. This was rejected. The second attempt was in December 1948, but we could not garner the 7 votes in the then 11-member Security Council because Syria voted against and the rest abstained, and we had, I think, Argentina, Colombia. You're right, South America was really then Ukraine and the US and the USSR, but we needed 7 and we didn't get that. So only in 1949, 7 new members joined the Security Council, and on March 4th, there was a 9-1 vote in the Security Council, where Egypt was the only one that voted against. So then we were accepted fully to the United Nations.
Yeah. Ron, for the audience, I also want to make clear when Ron referred to Ukraine, we had this anomaly where during the Cold War, the Soviet Union actually had 3 votes. The Soviet vote, plus the so-called independent votes of Ukraine and Belarus, which obviously were Soviet-controlled votes. So that was a different Ukraine than Ukraine today. But Ron, I want to ask you.
Yaakov Malik was the Russian ambassador that basically raised his hand
3 times. Ron, I wanted to ask you, you've had a lot of contact with the Arab world over many years in your diplomatic career. Did you ever hear from any Arab official or diplomat a kind of regret about the way the Arab world approached Resolution 181 and the categorical refusal to engage in a compromise proposal, which would, as we all know, have also created an Arab state, which in effect would have been a Palestinian Arab state?
No, David. I never basically heard something like that from them. We had a lot of talks with many Arab countries, under the radar screen, having a lot of respect for Israel, understanding, things that were completely different than what they spoke publicly. But no regret on Israel's establishment, never, at least in my conversations. But suddenly it jumps to me, David, you know me good enough. I remember that the only country in the world, and how funny that I remember that abstained 3 times, never voted for the state of Israel, was the United Kingdom. 2 times in the Security Council, and 1 time in the General Assembly. But back to the Arabs, no, never a conversation about regretting the establishment of the State of Israel.
And never a regret about failing to support a Palestinian state at the time?
No, because the conversations were again on issues, of course, on Israel, the Arab world, the Palestinian issue. Without that, we cannot solve the Israeli-Arab conflict. But it didn't go down to regret. We Israelis and Jews always regret everything, especially before our wives. But I never heard them regret this now.
Okay. And Ron, one last thing before we move forward to an era which you know much better from personal experience. What do you say to this narrative which continues to persist that the UN had no right to recommend statehood for Israel, that this was land theft, that Britain itself had no authority as a mandatory power, and that all of this land was originally Palestinian Arab land, and this was a travesty of Western powers? I'm sure you've heard that countless times. What do you say? What do you say to that narrative, which I continue to see to this day, including this morning on Twitter?
Look, I think again, it's a narrative that basically, when you look at it and you move away from all the things on the margins, it basically thinks and says Israel does not have a right for not just self-determination, but an independent country or a nation state for the Jewish people. What I can say about that is that the United Nations, when you look at this, opened, and established countries, or like, countries that came, countries from Africa, the former Soviet Union. We started with 50 countries, and today we're 193. Israel is exactly, part of the family of nations. We have the exact rights like any other nation, and the United Nations formally is the body that basically gives the so-called legitimacy, the formal legitimacy, and we are entitled to have that like any other country. So I see that again as part of the demonization process against Israel, and the fact that Jews are entitled to a country of their own, where they decide what their priorities are and don't have to wait for someone else to decide for them.
Right. So Ron, in 1947, the General Assembly voted 33 in favor, 13 opposed, 10 abstentions to endorse the two-state proposal. In March 49, as you said, the Security Council voted to accept Israel as a full member. Fast forward 26 years to 1975. The UN General Assembly meets and endorses what many believe was among the most pernicious, libelous resolutions ever, the so-called Zionism is racism resolution. What happened in those ensuing years that led the same body that welcomed Israel into the family of nations to endorse this libel against Israel and the Jewish people?
So I would look at this and look, at the Israeli-UN relations are generally a mirror of geopolitical events. So I would say that between 1949 and 1975, we can divide this time into 2 time frames, David. Before June 1967 and after June 1967. So until 1967, I think Israel was perceived, I know, it was perceived as a small, vulnerable, post-colonial state who achieved, independence, in which it was surrounded by strong Arab countries who constantly threatened it. So it received, you know, support for a small country. Immigrants came in, kibbutzim, socialist ideas, and things began to sour already in after 1956, with Israel aligned with declining colonial powers like Britain and France to oust an independent Egypt from the Suez Canal, and they were forced to retreat because of the U.S. and USSR. The Soviet Union, which showed who really controlled world politics in those years. And from 1967 to 1975, this little David, at least in the eyes of the world, becomes Goliath. So everything begins to flip on its head. Israel is suddenly perceived as strong, aggressive. Arabs suffer a terrible loss in the Six-Day War, which is humiliating. And Israel, occupies, in parentheses, the Golan Heights, Jordan, Samaria, Sinai Peninsula, and it suddenly is looked upon as, an occupier. So in the essence, on the wrong side of history, and then you had, the three no's of Khartoum: no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. And then resolutions like 242 in 1967, and after Yom Kippur 338. And in essence, Israel, especially after 1973, is perceived by the Arab world: we didn't manage to get Israel militarily. Let's try and go to war with Israel diplomatically and economically. And when you ask about general politics or world politics, of course, you had OPEC and 1973, the oil crisis, which of course was trying to push, force, and influence not just Western countries, but look, countries, 20 countries in Africa. I myself, as lived in Tanganyika and in Tanzania, amazing stuff that Israel did in African countries. They all cut diplomatic ties with Israel. And this, leading to 1975, I think it was pushed because of the politics and also the Soviet Union. People forget, and don't know that the Soviet Union then really, because of the, in addition to the Arab bloc, majority bloc, and many African countries, but the Soviet Union was really active in passing this resolution in 1975. So I think this is the background, David, in world politics that led to this absurd chutzpah of a resolution in 1975.
So, speaking of world politics, Ron, if we fast forward from 1975 to 1991, 16 years, the same resolution is now repealed. If I'm not mistaken, only the second time in UN history that a General Assembly session, a General Assembly resolution was repealed. World politics had changed again. Can you explain briefly what had changed that allowed that repeal to take place? And did it usher in a new era between Israel and the UN, or were things still more or less the same?
Okay, so, I think that still, although it was repelled in 1991, we'll get in a second, still in the corridors of the UN, this is still very, very strong, at least in the way people think towards Israel and the Jewish people. And the reason it was repelled, because if you look, 1977, Anwar al-Sadat comes over to Israel. 1979, we have a peace agreement with Egypt. So basically, Egypt also switched sides, from the Soviet Union to the United States. You have the Soviet bloc weakens with unrest both in Hungary and Poland. David, this is you. You can teach me and everyone else, about this. Then 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the crumbling, and in essence, so you have the 1989, the former Soviet countries and the Warsaw Pact basically wanting to establish new ties, and things are changing in the world and moving over more to the US side. And I would say that there's one thing that I think led to it that really made the difference, and that is the Madrid conference. The Madrid conference was in November 1991. The repealing of the resolution was in December 1991. Right. So here is, we're trying to get Israel with the Arab world, and everything that I said before that, 1980, fall of the Berlin Wall, fall of part of the Soviet Union. Right. I think this led to that, and you're absolutely right. This is a miracle. Did it happen in Hanukkah? I don't know. It should have happened in Hanukkah.
Or maybe we should reschedule Hanukkah for the date of the repeal.
Exactly.
And I just want to give a shout out, if I may, Ron, to President George H.W. Bush, who led the American effort on repeal, and to a name that's been in the news a lot in recent years, to John Bolton, who made it his personal mission as part of the Bush administration to help achieve the repeal. So let's now fast forward from 1991 to 2011, and history is again made in New York. Ron Prosor arrives as the ambassador of Israel, filling the shoes of people like Abba Eban, Chaim Herzog, Benjamin Netanyahu, and you serve as ambassador for 4 years. There have always been some in Israel who sort of play off the acronym in Hebrew, Shmum, for the UN, as if to suggest, who cares about the UN? It doesn't matter to Israel. You were ambassador. You were director general of the foreign ministry before that. Does the UN matter to Israel? And did you feel that in your 4 years, there were things that you achieved that you could share with our audience?
Absolutely. I think of course it matters, because we have a voice, we have an independent voice. When people go after us, we're able to stand up. And beyond that, when I came to the UN, and David, it's obviously a numbers game. And in the numbers game, the numbers are clear. So 22 countries of the Arab League, 56 countries of the Organization of Islamic Countries, and 120 something countries of the non-alignment movement. When all this comes together, I came in and I said to my amazing team out there, hey guys, don't tell me what we cannot do. I don't need you for that. I know the numbers. I was quite good in mathematics. What can we do under these circumstances? And we decided to look at the UN like 101 economics Samuelson, with demand and supply. He said, hey, there's demand for demonization and delegitimization against Israel at the UN. That's nice. Let's, in the supply, tell the UN what Israel is doing in the world, for the world, which is amazing stuff. And how do you do it at the UN? Only through resolutions. So when I came to the team and said, hey, we're going to pass Israeli resolutions at the UN, people said, God, what happened to him? When he came from London, probably Scottish whiskey. And what is he talking about? I mean, we'll be hammered off the General Assembly. Bottom line, we took issues that countries connected to: entrepreneurship for development, agricultural technologies. Bottom line, they work day and night, the amazing team. And 141 countries out of 193 raised their hand for an Israeli resolution. And in the sense, David, you use what you can in order to show the world what Israel is doing. And And if, from my point of view, this was absolutely important. Some of the tools that you have to use. For example, all of you know that one of the formal languages at the UN is Arabic, okay? I had at least 2 people who spoke fluent Arabic in the mission. And I said to them, hey guys, surprise, surprise, you're going to talk in the committees in Arabic. Now they said, oh, my Arabic is not good enough. I said, that's very nice. Now this is an order. I'm not just giving you some ideas. You talk in Arabic. Now just think what happens to the Arabs and the Europeans when someone presses the button and in Arabic goes after the Arabs. So in essence, the idea was using the full toolbox or adding additional tools in this toolbox. And I think in this sense, it's important to really show, the UN with all the problems does very good stuff, sustainable development, disabilities, David, women's rights. Israel is an amazing player in those fields. Right. I was proud to see Israelis working this, and bottom line, this was the strategy, and I think this is what we should be doing. We should be out there presenting these amazing countries that we represent.
Terrific, Ron. So let me ask you then, here in the United States, there's this perennial debate. It goes back to Ronald Reagan. It continues to this day. Is the United States better in or out? And we go through pendulum swings. We're in UNESCO, we're out of UNESCO. We're in the UN Human Rights Council, we're out of the UN Human Rights Council. I know you're an Israeli, not an American, but from your perspective as an Israeli, is Israel better served by having America in, even when it's a minority voice? Or is there a point to be made by having America out and using its leverage from outside?
Amazing question, David. And the bottom line for the United States of America, the minute you are in something, let's say the Council on Human Rights that that I call the Council on Human Wrongs, headed by amazing Jeffersonian democracies like Venezuela, Syria, amazing. Bottom line, the minute you are there, the decisions that they make, by the fact that you're there, you're legitimizing those decisions. The minute you go out, you basically say, hey guys, anything you say or write is not really serious, okay? So I think this is an important point for the US to make in saying we cannot influence a decision. We cannot, leverage anything in the Council on Human Rights or UNESCO. It's better for us not to be there to give it legitimacy, because when you're out, you automatically pull the carpet away under decisions, which are, of course, I don't even want to get into on the verge of science fiction. But for Israel, and Israel we still have to remember that in this relationship, not just with the U.S. The U.S. is the elephant. We are the mouse. Sometimes we think we're a mighty mouse, but we're still a mouse. And in the sense, I think on this issue, Israel should stay in, because afterwards, the U.S. won't have a problem returning to those organs, but Israel will. And I think it's important that we are there. And of course, it's not easy, because if we ask the United States to go out of Council on Human Rights or UNESCO, it seems a bit hypocritical that we stay in. But I think it's clearly the difference between an aircraft carrier and a Zodiac. And Israel has to stay everywhere. It can make its point, its voice. Although, again, we cannot influence that, it's important to hear our voice.
Daniel, I have 2 more questions, then I'm going to turn it over to you. Ron, we encounter this issue very often, and that is the difference in countries' bilateral versus multilateral policies. So Israel has blossoming relations, strategic relations, economic relations with a whole host of countries that are growing. We all know which countries. And yet when it comes to UN voting, some of these very same countries time and again vote not to abstain, not to absent themselves, but against Israel. And then they whisper in your ear, don't pay attention. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of tension between a country's bilateral relations with Israel and its multilateral policy at the UN?
Absolutely. And it always infuriated me because I want to give you two examples, okay? One, a funny example, but shows the, okay, you know, personal relations are important everywhere in every business, and especially also in politics. At the end of the day, you know, the relationship that you establish allows people to be flexible enough where they can. Bottom line, I had a very good friend, the ambassador of Panama at the UN. And before a certain vote, I said to him, are you supporting us on this? He says, yes. Are you going to vote for us? He says, absolutely no. I said, just a second, Pablo, what's going on? He said, I can't. The Arabs, they're all threatening me on committees, on, people that I want to be voted in different positions. So I looked at him and I said, Pablo, what can we do? He looked at me and I looked at him and I said, Pablo, I feel that you're beginning to catch the flu. He said, maybe I won't be able to attend the vote tomorrow. So the story here, I'm driving it now. When the US moved the embassy to Jerusalem, okay, you had X countries voting for and X countries voting against, and 21 countries couldn't find the General Assembly because of
they caught the flu. There was a pandemic that day.
It was a pandemic. Navigation skills. A lot of work is done in order for those navigation skills to take place. Okay, so you have this element, which is one, and then you have the when you say countries. I want to take a good example. I can give you an example of a country. You know that Israel and India have amazing relationship, economic, military, defense. The ambassador of India loves Israel. That's a very good friend of mine. When we allegedly hit a nuclear facility in Syria, he said to me, Ron, an amazing work. Yeah, you guys did amazing work. That's how you should keep on doing. And he went into the Security Council and said, we absolutely condemn the Israeli operation. Tika takita kataka taka. Why? Because there's a difference here between countries that feel that they can do that without paying a price. Israel, has to find a way not to allow this to happen. And I want to give you an example. I, for example, moved a mobile desalination facility from one country that it was heading in Africa to another country because one country that was supposed to get it voted against us on a certain vote. Okay, so there has to be a price, even with our small ability to do that, because we cannot continue this way.
Thank you, Ron. And my last question, Daniel, though I could spend hours talking to this legendary and wonderful diplomat. You know the work of the American Jewish Committee. We're an NGO. We're not a government. We don't have the power of the vote. We don't have the power to give or withhold desalination plants to countries. From your experience, what role can, and should an NGO like the American Jewish Committee play, Ron?
First, it's not just a role to play. You're playing a role, and a vital role, for many years, and especially there's no David. It's not just Shimon Peres who I can now imitate and saying, no, Mr. Harris, you are the real foreign minister of the Jewish people, and it's true. Why? Because I even told many people in the foreign ministry, when you enter a meeting with heads of mission or heads of countries, you really convey an amazing way both of Israel and the Jewish people that I hope many of our diplomats would be able to do. I think projects like Project Interchange, where you bring people to see with their own eyes what's happening in Israel, and then they come back to the respective countries, not just to the UN, back and basically get a better feel of what's happening. I'm seeing, things that you're doing on the designation of Hezbollah. By the way, this is something that we should work together, because we also at the Abba Evan Institute are working very hard on this. Those are important issues that really, from my point of view, make a difference. And there are not many people that can say that they made a difference, David. And you and your organization are entitled to really, with a lot of pride, say you made a difference, and you make a difference in a place where is a battleground, is a front line. Then we're really, really fortunate to have you on that on the front line. Thank you.
Ron, it's we who thank you for those very, very powerful words. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Ambassador Prosor. Our first question comes from retired U.S. Ambassador Herman Cohen, who's asking you, Ambassador Prosor, if you can give a sense of the geographic division of land that was contemplated in the UN plan compared to today's West Bank and others.
The percentages, look, I'll remind you that in the partition plan, basically, Israel is, look at Israel on the map. It's, I don't remember the percentages, but we said yes on the partition plan. And I'm reminding everyone, between a Jewish state and an Arab state, in things that Israel and Israelis and Jews could not even contemplate. Just don't forget that 181 means that Jerusalem itself is. So in the sense, when you look at this and you look at the borders of the partition plan, it shows again how the Arabs, in essence, didn't really allow Israel, even in the partition plan, the right to exist as a nation state of the Jewish people.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mario Fleck in Brazil. What would need to happen for the United Nations to review its standards and expel or not accept countries with levels of aggression to other countries like Iran, for example?
Okay, so the facts are that there are 193 member states in the United Nations. Out of the 193 member states, by UN standards, not by Ron Prosor, only 89 are democracies, okay? So over 100 have no clue. So the question is, what happens? And I can understand countries like Brazil or India sitting not as permanent members in the Security Council and saying, just a second, what's going on here? I mean, this is a strategic shot of what happened in 1945 after the Second World War. The United Kingdom, France, we are Brazil, we are India. What's going on here? Why don't we have a place in the Security Council? And I think that this and the fact that you have countries that have no connection to democracy running some of the shows means that the UN has to reform. It has to change. Can it do it? I don't know. I'm not sure that the UN can do that because most of the things are not on merit, and it's a real problem.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Phyllis F. who asks, how do you dispel the notion of occupation among people who aren't familiar with the history of Israel, yet oversympathize with Palestinians as displaced and oppressed people and condemn Israel?
It's like repeating again and again. It's like, and by the way, it's really important to repeat the facts because people don't really know. And and in the sense, all you have to do is call it again and again and again. And again, when you say you have to do that, not to get angry, not to lose it, maybe with some sarcasm and humor, basically repeat the point of Israel's history. And again, I know it's not easy because I've been there, but we don't have another choice.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ella Steinman in Vancouver, Canada. Do you hold out hope for a structural change at the United Nations when it comes to Israel? The committees, the agenda items, the resolutions each year at the GA. Are we doomed to see these continue until there's peace, or is there strategy despite full peace in the region?
No, I'm a bit more optimistic, okay? Because look, I can go down and maybe Phyllis knows, and that's what she's referring to. For example, Israel, agenda item number 4, talks about human rights violations all over the world. There's a specific Article 7 that basically singles out only the state of Israel. Not Syria, not Libya, especially Israel. And who votes for it? By the way, most of the countries, including the European countries, okay? This, I think, is going to change. One of the things, David, that I didn't talk about was, for example, the West European and Others group. So when Israel became part of the West European and Others group in the year 2000, we only were part of the group in New York. As you know, there are 4 centers of the UN in Geneva, in Vienna, and in Nairobi. Why are we part of the West European and Others group in Geneva and other places? So who can I go to? Of course, the British ambassador. Hey, Mark, why? No real answer. So we worked, and now we are in 3 out of the 4, both in Geneva and in Vienna. If we push hard enough, so things change. The minute now that we have, I think, a strategic paradigm shift that we didn't have a chance to talk about with Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. This means that you might see a change also in the voting patterns. When out of the 20 resolutions, every year, there's a resolution saying that Israel should stop occupying the Golan Heights and. I mean, some people, even in Europe, wake up and say, what's this resolution again? In everything that's going on. And so I think I'm optimistic in saying it's going to take time, but the world is changing. About reforms at the UN, that I don't see happening too fast. Why? Because the countries that want this thing to stay the way it is have quite leverage in the UN. So it's Russia, it's the United States, it's China, and let's add 2 of Europe in the Security Council. They want this to stay the way it is because it gives them enough power. They don't want anyone else intervening. I think this is going to be harder, but it's also possible that in a decade this would change also, because the UN cannot continue to function in such a how would I say, inefficient way. That's the most diplomatic way I could find to phrase the UN.
Daniel, let me jump in here for a moment. Ron, as AJC was very centrally involved in the 1990s in raising the WEOG issue, the West Europeans and other issue, and Israel's anomalous status as the only country without a regional home, and therefore without the right to vie for Security Council and other seats. What we learned, Ron, was you have to shine the spotlight. These are dirty, dark little secrets of the UN community, and most are happy to leave it that way. The more we can expose agenda item number 7 in the UN Human Rights Council that you refer to, the structural bias against Israel, the special committees in the Secretariat and elsewhere, the more we can shine the spotlight, the less able are the decent countries, the democratic countries, to defend. So let's keep shining the spotlight on the inequalities and the injustices. And that brings up a question, Ron, which we haven't discussed yet: UNRWA. UNRWA is itself an anomaly. All other refugees are handled by UNHCR. UNRWA was established, as you know best, not to resettle, but to keep the issue alive from generation to generation. How is Israel best served in dealing with UNRWA?
Well, you know, David, on this, I'm very, very clear. I mean, UNRWA is basically perpetuating the whole idea of refugees. They're inventing something that is basically, you know, unprecedented. So you have, you know, refugees, it's father, son, grandson. They go down generations. They incite. They basically create a situation where they also control some of health and education issues, which the Palestinian Authority itself should have jurisdiction on. I think that in today's world, the idea of merging UNRWA into UNHCR professionals who know how to do the job means that you can continue helping those who need help on the one hand, but on the other side, take away an organization that perpetuates that conflict and makes sure with incitement, education, it's unbelievable what they keep on doing in today's world. This has to change dramatically, and I hope the next administration would continue with the same line.
Back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ambassador Prosor. We have time for one final question, and this is coming from Deborah Rosenberg. What is the best way to teach Resolution 181 to Jewish millennials and other young Jews who blame Israel for the Palestinians lacking their own home?
What is the best way to teach them? Look, I started by telling the story and the different stories that came, you know, that basically to show the connection between the Jewish communities around the world and the state of Israel from the get-go, the importance that each and every one can really do today to strengthen this bond between Israel and the Jewish people. And I think this the story of this resolution is the story, you know, of hope, of determination, and at the end of the day, of execution operationally in creating and establishing the state of Israel. It's also an amazing, I think, lesson to when we work together, when we hold hands, when we cooperate. Oh boy, there's no one in the world that can really do anything to us. And the message is, you know, as Jewish people all around the world, we should respect each other, we should work with each other, and at the end of the day, achieve amazing results.
A wonderful note on which to end this very special conversation on this anniversary day. And I just want, if I may, to restate, re-emphasize what Ron Prosor said at the outset. Firstly, that the Zionist quest did not begin on November 29th, 1947. In some respects, it was a culmination, it was a legitimization, but only one of many steps that began in the late 1800s and that continued, and that, in our view, has given Israel more legitimacy from the perspective of the international community than almost any other nation on earth by the layers, from the Balfour Declaration to the League of Nations to the UN Special Committee on Palestine to the UN General Assembly vote. And number two, as Ron has said, if the Arab world had said yes rather than no on this day 73 years ago, we might have had a two-state solution for the ensuing 70 plus years. But decisions have consequences. And the consequence of saying no, unfortunately, is still being felt. So Ron, thank you for being with us on this very special day. And thank you to our worldwide audience for tuning in on this Thanksgiving weekend. Daniel?
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Ambassador, for that very fascinating and timely conversation. This Tuesday is Giving Tuesday, a global day of giving. So if you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting AJC on Giving Tuesday. Starting now, any gift will be matched dollar for dollar. Please visit ajc.org/donate. Ambassador, again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ron. Kol Tov. Bye-bye, everyone.